The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, and they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with the chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they were like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gua were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gua and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gua compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gua could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The little Albert experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child, however, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The little Albert experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner and took place in 1920. And the point of the little Albert experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim, and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also influenced an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist. And under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time, and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment. Which, on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment that Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy or being boiled alive or having an experimental sterilization take place on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. And these human experiments that took place by the Nazis are likely only rivaled by the Unit 731 experiment for some of the most diabolical human experiments of all time. And for that reason, I knew I had to discuss it on this video. This video went from strange to upsetting to disgusting to disturbing extremely quick. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's almost mind-boggling the lengths that people are willing to go to in the name of scientific discovery. And while that almost may sound noble out of context, I think that this video, if nothing else, proved that there is a line and rules need to be enforced. And I know it got super heavy at the end. So if you want a palate cleanser, check out this video on screen. It's a video about the craziest drugs from around the world. I put together a super interesting list of diverse countries with really obscure drugs. And I think you'll really like that video. And if that's not your cup of tea, then just check out the channel. There's a ton of good stuff on there. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, trust me, bro.